Hello, welcome back to Gender and the Pay Gap, Part 3. We are looking, as always, for those explanations that help us understand the gender pay gap between men and women. We focus in this episode on discrimination. So this one is really difficult to prove, quote unquote, right? Because nobody's ever going to admit to discrimination, and we take the implicit association test, we realize that we may have some biases we're not even aware of. So it's really hard to do this, but the good news is that researchers are figuring out ways to look for the smoking gun. So some experimental research generally indicates hiring discrimination is pervasive. There's all sorts of different studies out there if you care to look. And these discrimination events happen to be in line with what we know about gender norms. Some other interesting findings: men are less likely to be hired for female-dominated jobs and women, vice versa. There are all sorts of interesting research designs, like doing blind auditions at symphonies, where men and women audition behind a curtain. That has exposed some gender inequality in hiring. There have been blind resume studies where different names, male or female, or even ethnic sounding names, are sent in, and we see who gets called back. We saw in the research for this class, female professors get lower ratings, even if they're exactly the same person they present online as male or female. And more studies are coming out all the time. So it's interesting to see that there's ways to get this to show up in the data. And of course, there's always good old-fashioned self-reported discrimination. And as you can guess, it does have a gender component. And now for a little jog of our own biases and preferences and maybe some gender norms. In the research, what do you think is showing up as helpful or hurtful to a presenter's effectiveness? So male and female presenters gave presentations and then were scored. Do you think using humor is helpful or hurtful in those that reported grading those presentations? And now, to make it a lot more interesting, I'll help you think this through. It's not this. What could it be? Does it have a gender component? Well, we are talking about gender, so probably. Yes, it does. Now, between the two, does it help women and hurt men, or help men hurt women? What do you think? Discuss amongst yourselves. The answer is this. Women, tone it down. That reminds me of a joke to tell you. What do you call a fish with no eyes? Fish. And this is no joke. There have been things like the Google memo a few years ago. Larry Summers, famous economist who happened to be the Harvard president in 2005, saying some stuff like this. Yada, 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 yada. Issues of intrinsic aptitude and the variability of aptitude. And then socialization and continuing discrimination. So the question of nature being at the heart of some gender inequality is still a live one. And then, of course, you can get into feedback effects and start asking questions about what are the effects of this stereotype on girls' math performance or choice of major. There's a field of research that's called stereotype threat that looks at the impact of engaging stereotypes against somebody and their performance on a task for which they are stereotyped. For instance, girls at math, etc. We'll look at this more in depth when we talk about race. By extension, what are we to make of issues like this? We see there's a much larger proportion of men in higher paying fields like math and computer science. Is that nature? Or are they sorting themselves into these jobs because of gender discrimination and stereotype threat? I mean, ask yourself, if the harassment levels were high and the culture was poor for a job that you were considering, would it make sense for you to invest in it? So these are some of the ways we see discrimination play out. We're beginning to measure it. and we think it maybe helps explain gender pay inequality and especially the job sorting issue.